Biafrans. We must always remember the history of what happened to us decades ago. If we fail to remind our people what happened, which eventually led to the Biafra Nigeria Civil War, history might repeat itself. Our people must know that it was a British conspiracy to commit genocide against Biafra because of their hatred against Biafrans, and this hatred has continued till date. That's why our great leader, who is a British citizen, is still in DSS detention, and the British is not lifting a finger to help, because they do not want the emergence of Biafra. But it is too little too late, because no force on earth can stop the coming of Biafra except God himself. Watch the video.
Over 1 million Igbos, Biafrans, all British Commonwealth citizens, died in the Nigeria Biafra Civil War. Today, more than 30 years later, questions remain. Was it genocide? Was it backed by the British government, willingly or unwillingly?
If you have part of the population, or as I say, the whole population being wiped out and murdered without any protection on these grounds, ethnic or religious or economic grounds and so on, you have genocide.
The Nigeria Biafra Civil War was also the first media famine. For the first time we saw starving children in newspapers, in magazines and on television.
Well, it was very much the sort of headline news in the papers here for a long time, and opinion was greatly divided as between those who felt that that the Igbos had a case and that Nigeria was badly governed and that it was time that something happened and that the Igbos were good people who deserved to be, and others who felt that Nigeria should remain as it was and the boundaries should remain, and if you fiddled about with the boundaries you were going to be in real difficulty, and it was a very bad precedent for other parts of Africa.
Nigeria, the richest and most populous nation in Africa. 360,000 square miles, the same size as Britain, France and Germany. 65 million people, 3 major tribes, Hausas in the north, Yorubas in the west, Igbos, Biafrans in the east. Some say the British rigged the odds against the Igbos from the beginning, from even before independence.
Of course, we also knew that the elections by 1960 had been rigged. Everybody in the know knew that we had our boys in the north, our puppets, we'd put them in power. They hadn't won at all. The people in the south had won, the nationalists.
Some say war was inevitable. The rest of Nigeria had always been jealous of the unity, the strength of the Igbos, the way they had managed to march together to build a better future for themselves and their children. In 1966, the world's attention was focused on Eastern Europe and the brutal Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Middle East, the continuing conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, Southeast Asia, the American war in Vietnam and all its horrors. But throughout Nigeria, up to 30,000 Igbos were being attacked and brutally murdered because they were Igbos.
It's those who want us to lose the war in Vietnam. It's militants, activists, revolutionaries, anarchists and communists. That's who it is.
To the international community, it was just another African conflict. They didn't want to get involved. It was no concern of theirs. They looked the other way. They had other things on their plate.
I would say that there is a difference between when a man belonging to a rich country dies and when a man belonging to a poor country dies. Not necessarily black man, because you can have the same problem somewhere in Asia. No, I believe that the United Nations, the international community, is still dominated by a very Europocentric attitude.
Tuesday, May 30, 1967, enough was enough. The Igbos, alone, isolated, ignored, declared their independence. Their leader was Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu. The supreme commander and head of the military regime in Nigeria was Lieutenant Colonel Gowan. Both men had been educated and trained in Britain. The war that followed was one of the longest, bloodiest and most disastrously fought civil wars in history. In just 3 years they used more small arms ammunition than was used by British forces during the whole of the Second World War. The casualties were horrifying. The war was also unlike any other civil war in modern history. The Nigerian government, backed by the British, regularly and deliberately strafed and bombed civilian targets.
I saw 10 deliberate bombing attacks on the civilian population, either hospitals or marketplaces, and with no question of any military target being in the vicinity.
At precisely 1:30 every day they come over the town as the marketplace is full, as patients are sitting out on the lawns at hospitals. Here comes the next one. He's just above the mission now.
I looked up and I heard the explosion. The convent was still there, but then towards the school there was a cloud of smoke rising up to the sky.
The children's ward was the worst. Children's ward got a rocket right through the roof. There was a mother and child killed in bed, and another child was killed in another ward, and another child was cut in half up behind the kitchen.
Why it was deliberate, they finished an operation, the next 3 hours they come back again. So you could see that kind of thing for 3 days or 4 days.
Even more horrifying, the Nigerian government deliberately used famine as a weapon of war. The name Harold Wilson became a curse. Starvation was known as the Harold Wilson syndrome. Many people, young and old, rich and poor, went to Biafra to help the starving and the dying. One of the youngest, the most famous, the most glamorous was Princess Cecile de Bourbon-Parma, sister to one of the pretenders to the Spanish throne. She told a committee of the US Senate what she saw. On the committee was Senator Edward Kennedy.
I told him how I have been going out of the Biafra, and that one of the last nights I was with the children and the plane was not coming. And we were very anxious, and I had in my arms a little girl of, I don't know, 10 years old. And she was very anxious herself to see if the plane would come and save her. And finally we hear the motor's engine, the plane is coming. She looked at me, she smiled, and she died. And I looked at Senator Edward Kennedy, and I saw he was crying.
Biafra made aid organisations throughout the world what they are today. It enabled them to develop and perfect their emergency feeding and rescue skills that have since then saved millions of lives around the world.
It was the school of humanitarian action, Biafra, so I think it was the beginning of a new concept of wars and of the relation between humanitarian personnel, armies and the media.
Questions remain unanswered. Was it genocide? Was the bombing and strafing of civilians? Was the deliberate mass starvation of innocent because they were?
Why is there no Biafra Memorial? By Donu Kogbara. I returned from Kigali a few days ago. The highlight of my trip was a harrowing visit to a museum commemorating the 1 million or so Rwandese people who were slaughtered during a genocide that shocked the world in 1994. 250,000 victims of that vicious Tutsi-Hutu conflict are buried on the premises, so it's a cemetery as well as a place of remembrance and learning. In my 20 seconds, I toured Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, in appalled silence. Situated on a 45-acre campus and comprising museums, exhibitions, monuments, sculptures and memorial sites, it is an impressive tribute to the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Nazi era. On May 30, 1967, the secessionist Republic of Biafra was declared by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, the then governor of Nigeria's eastern region, following deadly tensions between northerners and members of the Igbo ethnic group. The Igbos were joined by some minorities from the region that is known as the Niger Delta today. Examples of senior non-Igbos who supported Biafra as a matter of principle include Ojukwu's Ibibio deputy, Major General Philip Asuku Effiong, and my father Ignatius Suaj Kogbara, the Biafran ambassador to the United Kingdom, and an Ogoni from Rivers State. I have very clear memories of the Civil War. I was 7 years old when it started and 10 when it ended on January 5, 1970. I will never forget my totally stressed mother, Anne, driving my 3 siblings and me out of Port Harcourt in the family's grey Ford Cortina as federal troops, the enemy, advanced on the city we called home. I recall an enraged Biafran army officer shooting, one by one, panicking policemen who had hopped onto their bicycles and joined the exodus from Port Harcourt, alongside fleeing women and children. Instead of staying behind to help our soldiers and able-bodied male civilians fight the invaders to the finish. By then my father was in London, representing the rebel government, and I recall being stuck in a long queue of escaping vehicles, taking refuge a southeastern village where the natives ate lizards to survive, and eventually being airlifted out of Biafra in the dead of night on a cargo plane from an airstrip in a town called Uli. By 1968, we were safely ensconced in Daddy's residence in a salubrious part of London, and I still feel guilty about the fact that we got out at the height of a massive humanitarian crisis, leaving so many friends, relatives and strangers to suffer the horrors of a war that wasn't their fault. Biafra was the world's first fully televised war and a very big deal. Between 1 and 3 million Biafrans died, mostly from starvation. Images of hollow-eyed youngsters with distended bellies filled TV screens across the globe. Many of us heard for the first time about kwashiorkor, a form of malnutrition caused by protein deficiency. According to the distinguished US-based Igbo writer and academic Chigozie Obioma, the Biafran War of Independence was an internecine war the scale of which Africa had never seen when it took place. Most of those who died were non-combatants. It was the singular reason for the creation of Doctors Without Borders, and it is believed that more small weapons, hand grenades, rifles, etc., were used in it than in World War II. So why have the Nigerian authorities never erected a memorial to those who lost their lives and endured unspeakable agonies? Yes, we lost the war. Another vivid memory that will never leave me is of my father waking me and my sister up to tell us that the war was over and consoling us as we wept inconsolably. But General Yakubu Gowon, the then Nigerian president, promised that there would be no victor and no vanquished. And one would have thought that as time went by, the victims of this traumatic phase in our history would have been officially acknowledged. However, those who have led Nigeria since 1970, there hasn't been a single Igbo head of state in the past 54 years, by the way. Despite Igbos being one of the 3 main ethnic groups, clearly regard reconciliation as a dish that is best served in miserly portions. The vindictive branch of the Nigerian establishment goes out of its way to punish Igbos for daring to rebel half a century ago, while the more benign elements just want to brush Biafra under the carpet and label it as an unfortunate episode that is best forgotten. But it cannot and will not be forgotten. Scars remain. As my new novel, The Road to the Country, shows, says Obioma, when a war begins, it never truly ends. It continues over generations in small and invisible ways. This is a reason why Nigeria needs to create a monument to commemorate Biafra, not to point to a war that has ended, but one that continues in a subterranean form. Major General Effiong wound up brokering a ceasefire and peace deal on Ojukwu's behalf. His son, Dr. Philip Effiong, a professor of drama and humanities at Michigan State University, who also exited Biafra with his mother and siblings via Uli, thinks that a memorial is long overdue. There were so many innocent young and elderly casualties, and these people should be remembered in a befitting central location. Matthew Hassan Kuka is a northerner who had no personal stake in Biafra and comes from an area that was anti-Biafra. He is now the bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Sokoto, and when I asked him whether he thought a memorial would be appropriate, he said, "If we were a serious nation, nobody would have to ask this question. It is a measure of Nigeria's small-mindedness that Biafra has not been properly remembered. There should be a place of genuine record that acknowledges victims on both sides of the war." Stay tuned for more UA dates. Don't go away.